You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Michael Spotts, a senior visiting research fellow at ULI's Terwiliger Center for Housing. Michael chats with us about takeaways from the Shaw Symposium on urban community issues. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our bus-only scarves. The fall is almost here, so get one to warm your transit-loving heart today. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire, including our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, Read Around the World. We pull the best news about cities from around the web and share them with readers each morning. It's the best newsletter in the business, so try us out for free by going to theoverheadwire.com. You'll also find links to buy the scarf as well as our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning in Practice. Go to theoverheadwire.com to find out more. Well, Michael Spotts, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me. I've been listening for a long time, and it's exciting to join the podcast.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming on. I mean, I see your name, and we've talked before, obviously. And like I said, I see your name in a lot of reports and really good stuff from your former employer, et cetera. I'm curious, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and then how did you get into thinking about cities?
Sure. So I've been working in issues related to predominantly housing, but broader community development for about 15 years now, maybe 15 or 16. And it's interesting because my career started out really rural focused, not focused on cities. I grew up in rural central Pennsylvania in the middle of a farming area in coal country, and saw a lot of economic disadvantage, a lot of things that have been fueling a lot of New York Times think pieces where people go to diners these days. And that was sort of frustrating because I, grew up in that area, saw a lot of vibrancy, saw sort of the pictures of what some of these smaller towns used to look like. And in some ways, the smaller towns had some of the same sort of amenities and vibrancy that some of our bigger cities have today. So I originally wanted to get into rural development and rural community development, which I worked for the Housing Assistance Council for a few years. But that brought me, ironically, working for a rural-focused nonprofit, that brought me to Washington, D.C., where they're headquartered, and I got my first taste of actual city living and saw some of the same. It was amazing that for all the differences, all of the similarities there were between what was great about some of these communities, but also what was challenging. So I ended up having sort of a shift of focus to a more sort of neutral perspective on whether I wanted to do urban or rural work, but ended up going to grad school in Pittsburgh and really falling in love with that city and moving back here after graduation. And so what I've been actually doing is focus on applied policy research. And that is making the connection between sort of the academic literature about what works and what doesn't for urban planning and development and actual practice. So I try to sort through some of the research and information that's out there, some of the examples of best practices and policy interventions, and try and translate that and make it digestible for practitioners on the ground that are looking to either change local policies or state policies, or developers or other sorts of on-the-ground practitioners that are doing the work, helping them identify potential solutions to some of the critical challenges facing cities and communities.
I'm curious about that rural-urban difference and, the difference in forms, your feeling about the difference between them. Can you go into more detail about what the similarities are? I like the similarities, but also some of the differences.
Some of the similarities, I think a lot of it depends on the type of community you grew up in or were familiar with. I grew up in the part of central Pennsylvania where I grew up was a mixture of rural areas interspersed with manufacturing and mining towns. So these manufacturing and mining towns actually have sort of a pretty high degree of density, or had, I should say. Some of them have lost 90% of their population due to economic shifts. But you see, the urban form can be quite different. You don't see a lot of mid-rise or high-rise apartments, although you do see some of them, but you actually do see almost some of I won't go as far as to say older European style density, but you do see a lot of houses that are very clustered together mixes of uses, ground floor shops where the proprietors live upstairs. And you can see the bones of those types of communities in these cities. And the town I grew up in, believe it or not, actually had transit at one point. There was a town connecting a small city with a small village. And there was a trolley line running between them, predominantly, I don't know the history behind all, but ferrying mine workers from the larger town to the mines out in the smaller village. So the similarity was there, but you could also see where the differences lies, that they were much more reliant on one industry, I would think, more so than some of the larger cities. I mean, you read about the economic decline in a lot of former manufacturing centers, that it was sort of broad scale economic shifts that happened to impact multiple industries all around the same period of time that led to a lot of their deterioration. But, when you have an area that's so dependent on one factory or one industry, you can see, for all we hear about the population loss in Baltimore or Detroit, a lot of that population loss is partially for the region as a whole, but it's more so the center city, because if you look at a lot of it has been, you see suburban growth during some of these periods, whereas in some of the rural areas, you do see some of the same type of sprawling development, people getting 5-acre lots, 10-acre lots, but not actually using it for agricultural productivity. So you do see some of the similar trends, but you see much more of just the broader emptying out of the overall population. It's a difference between, for those familiar with the DC metro area, it's not the equivalent of moving from the District of Columbia out to Loudoun County or outer Montgomery County in Maryland. It's the equivalent of leaving from DC to Atlanta. These areas, again, places that might have had a population of 25 to 50,000 that now have a population of 3 to 5. And it's hard to maintain, that economic vibrancy when you have that degree of population loss.
It's so interesting. I'm curious also if some of those towns have recovered in some other fashion, because the industry left, because people left. There's obviously good bones there. And so some of them, even if, a small number of them might have come back because of tourism, or there's something about the town that kind of calls to people. I know in Texas and even in California and other states, there's these small towns that still exist because they've made another name for themselves, whether that's tourism or, in Sonoma, there's little towns all over the place. They're connected now to the wine country, even though everything else disappeared. So that's probably a thing too. Some of the smaller ones have kind of regenerated themselves and reinvented themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not every small town. When I go, my parents still live in that area, and a lot of my family does. And when we go back and visit, we still see some, drive through some towns that, are functionally ghost towns. And there's actually a famous ghost town, Centralia. You may or may have heard of it. There's actually a mine fire underneath it. And they bought everyone out except for a couple lone holdouts in the town. And so it's actually literally like a ghost town with only population of 0, or I think maybe 1 at this point. But figuratively speaking, you see a lot of ghost towns, but there are actually, because of those good bones, you're starting to see some downtown revitalization. Some of the problems that they face are self-inflicted, in the sense that some of the same mistakes around, hollowing out your downtown core because you paid to have the freeway interchange and the property tax breaks for the big box retailers in between the two towns. And, to a certain extent, any single small town is not going to be able to stop that trend that happened nationwide, but they don't need to subsidize it. and a lot of them did in a competition for tax base. So they still have some of those forces fighting against them. But I don't want to paint it as a good thing, because you never want to see that level of economic decline. But when things get bad enough, it becomes really inexpensive and really lowers the barriers of entry for people that have a small amount of resources to invest in revitalization of that community. So we actually do see some areas where there are still some natural amenities. Believe it or not, in some cases, the mines themselves can become tourist attractions. There's a couple towns that have mine tours and like actual rides that go through an old mine. Outdoor recreation around, all-terrain vehicles and dirt bikes and stuff like that can actually, you're starting to see some of these small towns have, Airbnb listings pop up. And when it takes you maybe a tenth of the amount of money and capital it costs to start up a coffee shop in downtown Shamokin, which is the town next to where I grew up, than it would even in a place like Harrisburg, an hour and a half away, then you can see how, the people that are doing well can reinvest in their community. And we're starting to see some early sprouts of that revitalization in some cases.
Yeah, it's awesome. We could talk about this probably for the whole hour, but I do want to get to the topic at hand. So how did you get involved with ULI? And also, what is ULI, I should ask?
Sure. So the Urban Land Institute is a nonprofit network of real estate and urban development professionals that are dedicated to advancing the Institute's mission of shaping the future of the built environment and having transformative impact in communities worldwide. So it is focused on cities and urban areas and on responsible and sustainable growth. So I became involved. I've been doing applied policy research consulting for a couple of years after spending some time in the policy development and research team at an affordable housing nonprofit called Enterprise Community Partners. And their Terwiliger Center for Housing at ULI has a standing senior visiting research fellow position. So I had done some research with them when I was at Enterprise, looking at some specific affordable housing related challenges, particularly around the cost and cost effectiveness of development. And so I'd worked with them in the past and thought very highly of their mission and their network of practitioners that want to help put forward a vision of urban growth, and had the opportunity to work with them on a couple different research projects. And it was exciting for me because, my prior role, I had been predominantly focused on housing solely. And within that subset, most of my work was on affordable housing programs, sort of subsidized income restricted programs. And one of the opportunities to work with the Terwiliger Center was to expand that view to more issues related to broader growth of our communities, our cities, and our regions, as well as being able to look at the full spectrum of housing opportunities and looking at housing affordability or attainability. How well is the broader market meeting the needs of the full population, and not just looking at the income restricted affordable housing piece, because it's a broader ecosystem. And that if the housing market reaches further down the spectrum, that means that we can do more with the limited affordable housing resources that we have. So with the Terwiliger Center, I still get to focus on both, but I get to take a broader view of the housing market.
So this specific piece was written from basically a symposium that was put together by the Terwiliger Center and the infrastructure arm, Curtis Infrastructure. I'm curious, how did this all come together, and when did it happen? Why did it happen? And, what happened?
Sure. The Shaw Symposium is an annual event that is endowed by Charles Shaw, former ULI chairman. And the topics can vary from year to year. So this is not always put on by the Terwiliger Center or the Curtis Infrastructure Initiative. But this year, it was put on in June this year as a virtual symposium. Usually it's in person. But the goal of this effort is to identify a critical urban development challenge or an emerging opportunity and bring practitioners together from various regions, parts of the real estate development industry, and to help address the challenges and opportunities that we're facing. And so this year's focus was on equitable investment in infrastructure and housing. And for a number of reasons. First of all, it's always Infrastructure Week, it seems like. And
but now it really was.
Now it really was. Infrastructure Week finally came. And it was in the news a lot. But it was also, we're taking a look at everything that was going on. So you have the deferred investment in infrastructure. We have lots of ongoing challenges and needs in the housing market. We have an affordable housing crisis. And there's a broader realization that the infrastructure and housing needs are connected, because you can't have housing that is well located, that provides access to jobs, services, and other life necessities without the infrastructure that supports people getting from here to there, that supports living in a given location. Likewise, you can't have an efficient infrastructure system if you're not planning for your housing growth and urban development. So we're seeing a lot of the trends in the real estate industry and in urban growth and development. So you see revitalization of urban cores that's been going on for some time now, but there's conversations about, can the infrastructure handle some of this growth, especially in legacy cities that they're dealing with both deferred maintenance of their infrastructure systems as well as the needs for new infrastructure. And then there was the issue that has been there for a long time, but is being brought to the fore with some of the unrest and the protests in the last year of segregation, of the role that both infrastructure and housing systems played in racial discrimination disparities, the legacy of redlining, the legacy of urban highways and urban renewals, cutting through, destroying many African American communities and other communities as well. And so that at the same time that there's all these opportunities to look at the future of how we can better plan our housing and our infrastructure, there's also this strong push to look backwards as well and identify what we did in the past that contributed to some of the challenges that we have today. So, the goals of this session were to take a look at how we can bring practitioner expertise together to develop a framework that will help enable equitable access to transportation, improve housing attainability across the spectrum, reconnect and reinvigorate neighborhoods, and look at the community development aspect, particularly in those neighborhoods that had been harmed by some of the legacies of the way we built our infrastructure and planned our communities in the past, and proactively center and address some of these historic racial disparities in community investment. So that was our main objective of the session.
It's so interesting because there's so many things we're starting to kind of see as something that can be pulled together into one instead of in their individual silos. You have historic inequities in housing, in transportation. You have this not so new actual threat of climate change. Added on to that, you have, sea level rise, resilience, thinking as well. What was kind of the overall feeling of combining these topics together and trying to get them under one, spotlight, as it were?
Well, because we are working with practitioners that are actually doing, in many cases, real estate development out in the field, or in some cases, we had urban planners in the room, we had representatives of transit networks. These are real world issues that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And I'm glad you brought up the environmental resilience piece, because that was one of the goals that I left out, looking at health and environmental sustainability and climate risks. But when you're working for, let's say, an infill multifamily developer, you already know that you have to deal in many ways. If you're developing responsibly, you know that you'll have to deal with stormwater runoff and infrastructure needs, because jurisdictions are more and more requiring more of you in that front. If you are working in a coastal area, for example, you're seeing how your portfolio is at risk related to climate change, rising sea levels, increased intensity of hurricanes. These are practitioners that are engaging with this in the real world. And because they're engaging with this in the real world, they also know where the pain points are. So they know when the system isn't working in an integrated manner, and they have ideas for how it should work in a more integrated manner. So when you have one government agency saying you need to be doing one thing, and another agency saying something completely different, when you've been dealing with that in some ways your whole career, then you have ideas of how the system could work better if it was more integrated.
That's another thing that came out too. You mentioned health. The healthcare is really interesting. Takeaway 5, there's 10 takeaways, and then there's a framework for investing. There's 7 points there. Of the 10 takeaways, I was specifically interested in takeaway 5 because it discussed the importance of looking at all these systems together, like we were just discussing. But specifically, thinking about housing and healthcare and how they're connected. And I feel like healthcare is a perfect example of that silo that we don't think of in a systems way. People need to get to appointments. People need to be housed. And so they're not, taking up emergency bed space in these hospitals. There's all these kind of synergies that happen there. And I find that really fascinating that we often haven't thought about that, individual sectors out there that obviously need these things, housing, transportation, et cetera. But we often don't talk about them that way. They're just kind of, that's healthcare. That's off in the boonies. But actually it's all connected to each other.
Exactly. And it's a challenge because how many hospital systems are surrounded by seas of parking? Yeah. And you're creating barriers to entry, and you're raising the floor of mobility that people have to be able to get to in order to easily access healthcare services. And there's spillover implications on that. And another example, just like health, is in the educational system. How many universities or colleges or community colleges are in some ways their own gated communities within the cities in which they live and populate. They have really huge impacts on the surrounding communities, both positive and negative. So they bring money into the community through, the people that come to the college and spend money there. But they also, if they're not integrating from a systems approach with the urban planning approach and housing policy, university towns can really drive housing prices up if development as a whole is not keeping up, or if universities are not building dorms, depending on the nature of the university. And if it's a grad school, it can have different implications for different types of housing markets. But if you're not looking at how the university fits within the broader system, it can create some challenges. But again, it's another example where you can look at it as an opportunity as well, if you can get that systems approach. Because you have, in many cases, large parcels of institutional land that you can use for redevelopment projects. You have, in some cases, endowments, large sums of capital through these health networks or educational endowments that can be invested in the community. You have opportunities for integration and pilots. If you're talking about universities, how can they create a STEM program targeted in underserved communities that creates a pipeline from local community neighborhoods into the higher educational system? For the health sector, can you use some of your resources to drive better outcomes through community-based care and other types of innovation pilots? So I think we can look at these institutions now that are operating often, though not exclusively, in silos. And we definitely should think of the challenges that creates. But I think we can also be optimistic and look at what can be achieved if you start seeing better integration, because these are often very rich, from various manners of speaking, rich institutions that have opportunities to play better with the local community.
Yeah, the Anchor Institution, I guess, is the formal name that
Yes.
has been kind of thrown around for a while about that. These main players in cities and towns, the educational, whether it's a town-gown kind of relationship between a school and a town, or even just the healthcare. There's a huge healthcare complex. For example, in Portland, OHS, was it Oregon Health Science or something like that? It's one of the largest employers in Portland, and it's also, very big driver of transportation because of the streetcar and the aerial tramway and all that stuff. So there's a huge connection there that can be made if the right connections personally, I guess, are made in those areas. It's really fascinating to think about. And so in terms of those, the 10 key takeaways, in addition to the one we just chatted about, was there one that kind of struck your fancy or kind of stood out from the others? Was there a topic at the symposium that was discussed that kind of made you think, oh, this is new. This is something that I hadn't really thought of before? Because obviously you've been thinking about this stuff for a while. Maybe there was something that popped up that was new to you.
So this is something I've been focused on for a while. So there was a lot of, I would say, illumination of things that I've been thinking about a little bit, but really comes to the fore when you hear practitioners that are doing it out in the field. So, a lot of conversation and a lot of ink has been spilled writing about how we can make suburban areas more sustainable. But we had a practitioner from the Tampa Bay metro region that is actually working with underserved communities from a transportation perspective to help improve micromobility, to help lower income households go to work, to access job stores and services. And what does that actually look like in the field? That's something that was really illuminating about some of these opportunities that are out there, because those of us that are national policy researchers, we read about a lot of different things and we have a lot of different ideas, but it's not as deep as someone that's actually out in the field and it's doing this work. And one of the things that stuck to me, and it cut across a lot of the different takeaways, was that we have to be adaptive and resilient, and not just from a climate perspective, although definitely from a climate perspective. Every single practitioner that spoke talked about restoration and fixing things that were broken or mistakes from the past. And a lot of them tied to some of the explicitly discriminatory practices of again, redlining, urban infrastructure investment, in the urban highway system. And one of the things that struck me from this is that we need to be cautious right now and have a degree of humility that we may not, all the answers that we're thinking about right now, people 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, Now, hopefully they can say that they won't be able to point to something like redlining and that is as explicitly discriminatory. And it's obviously we have a long way to go in rooting out some of the issues of structural racism. But even if we're successful over time at reducing its implications and rectifying and trying to repair and restore and make up for some of those past wrongs, even if we're successful, if we're that, like, how sure are we that the technical solutions, the urban form solutions that we're pushing for today, people won't look back at us 50 years from now and say, like, what were they thinking? You know? And so, that can paralyze you. And it could actually lead to inaction when we have an actual crisis right now that we have to respond to. So my takeaway is that we have to have measurement and opportunities for evolution, trial and error. If we can make our mistakes, can we make them quick and small instead of over a long 30-year period and then things really break and the whole system breaks down? Can we build up a system that, again, has the humility to assume that we can't micromanage every detail and that we will get things wrong and that we need to build in opportunities for trial and error, and then the measurement and evaluation that enables us to learn from that and change our systems so that we can accelerate uptake of the things that are demonstrated to work instead of, I get frustrated. I do some just local advocacy work around housing and community growth issues. And we develop these really, really interesting plans that are highly technical in nature. And by the time we finish them, the market has shifted a little bit and we have to go back and revisit. So if we can build more evolution into the system, I think that was one of the takeaways that really, really struck me over the course of the conversation based on what was being said in the room.
That's so interesting. Over the last couple of episodes that we've had folks on, we've been talking about kind of this 20-year cycle of, renewal and what happens after 20 years, people kind of reset and something starts over again. So with Peter Norton, who we had on just released today, he talks about, obviously, his book is about Futuramas and the idea that selling the future every 20 years or so, and a new one comes out to kind of sell this future. Gabrielle Esperty came on to talk about the oil crisis in the 70s. And, we were talking about these 20-year timeframes of people's imaginations changing. I think it's something similar in what you're talking about in terms of we don't necessarily know if what we're prescribing now is going to be the answer in 20 years. And I feel like I've been doing this now for just under 20 years. And I have my own example. I mean, the mixed traffic streetcar was something that we promoted in the 2000s at Reconnecting America. And we've now kind of learned from some of those mistakes that you can't mix them in traffic. It's not really the best way to go. And so, at the time we thought this is the solution. This is what we can do in a lot of cities, bring back the streetcar. It worked then, it can work now. But there's a lesson in that. There's a lesson in that making that mistake 20 years ago and being able to make mistakes. I mean, obviously, me and my colleagues all had the best intentions, but it was something that, later on, there's like, well, what were you thinking? We have an example of that. And I think that that's very powerful, especially when you look back at urban renewal, when you look back at some of these things that people thought at the time were good ideas, but later on you look back and you're like, man, that was horrible and horrendous.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I think it can be paralyzed. You can look at that situation, but, mixed traffic streetcars, that's a good example. But, if you build into the system that ability to adapt and evolve, a mixed traffic streetcar could theoretically become a streetcar that has its own dedicated lane. The problem with a lot of our planning and zoning policies is that we're passing this policy and this is how it shall be forevermore. And variances are the exception to the rules. Changes are the exceptions to the rules. And instead, I think if we can shift our mindset towards an assumption that communities will evolve rather than this is the plan and this is what we will achieve and this is how it's going to be forever. I think that if we can shift that mindset, then I think we'll have, you look at, say, a mixed traffic streetcar in my county, but it's really a city that I live in now, Arlington, Virginia, was supposed to get a mixed traffic streetcar. And because it was very much this like rigid, our systems aren't integrated, it's all or nothing approach, because of political opposition, the streetcar was canceled. And they've had some enhanced bus service then, but there was not as much evolution or adaptability to get to that efficient next phase of growth. So if we view our plans or our investments as the first step in a process, more so than the end state, then maybe, again, we could take one of the mixed traffic streetcars that may be struggling with ridership now, and maybe there'll be more political will moving forward to give it its dedicated lane. And then all of a sudden, in making that initial investment where you might have learned from some of the mistakes, it's not a mistake. It's just the first building block for the growth of the community.
That's a really good point. I'm also interested in that, just the general idea of looking back at things. And so in Peter Norton's book specifically, some folks, I just won't name them, but there's folks that basically said, what do we need to learn from history? It's not important. The future is where we're at or where we'll be. And I find that fairly disturbing because I think that obviously there's a lot to learn from history. And so I'm always curious about, is there a tension between the folks that want to just move forward and the folks that want to look back at history and see what we did wrong to make sure that we don't do that wrong again?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a different psychological mindset of whether you are looking sort of nostalgic at the past or eagerly towards the future, and whether you view change as a good thing or a bad thing. And I think there's if you're so stuck in the past, I mean, we've seen in recent years how much an overly nostalgic view of what the 40s through the 60s were can get society into trouble. Because if you're looking too much towards the past, it can do one of two things. You can be trying to freeze something in time, often in a way that never actually existed. That utopian past was never so utopian, especially if you were non-white. Or you could look at, I mentioned paralysis before, you can look at all the mistakes that we've made in the past and be like, it can just freeze you sometimes. And you can say that, well, we can't do anything unless we can guarantee that we can solve for these 900 different mistakes that were made in the past. And until we get to that perfect state, we can't do anything. And then there's people that, again, as you mentioned, on the dynamic of looking forward, there's the element of we haven't learned anything, we need to learn things, or people that are overlooking what we can learn from the past. But also, there's people that look forward constantly that don't understand that just as there was a lot of negative in the way we did things in the past, that, change can be really difficult to, just being realistic, change is difficult to manage, and a lot of people struggle with it, and for a variety of reasons. So if you're not looking at this sort of looking backward and looking forward together in concert, then you could get yourself into trouble.
I'm interested too in the little time capsule that the symposium existed in, because as we know, we're in the future now, and we know the results of the infrastructure bill vote. I'm curious what the feelings were at the time, and what people were looking towards or what they felt was going to happen, because we know what we know now, but obviously at the time that the symposium took place, people weren't necessarily sure what was going to happen.
Sure. So I think there is, again, because we're working with practitioners, there's a mixture of, some people are more optimistic, some are more pessimistic, and there's the straight up realists in the room. So you had the full spectrum of perspectives. And because you had that spectrum, I think there was a lot of hedging. Don't want to say hedging in sort of a bad way, but it's just, or in sort of the gambling sense, but just knowing that, at that point in time, there was still a lot of talk that the infrastructure bill would be much larger and potentially more transformative than it is. And that was obviously baked into some of the conversation. People were talking about the opportunities that could exist if the infrastructure bill went big. But in reality, given the build out for infrastructure projects, and from your work on transit programs, how long it takes to conceive of, plan for, get funding for, and then actually build a transit line, that, a lot of the things that they're talking about were developed under the previous paradigm. And people that are working on these projects have seen the ebbs and flows. So a great example of this is sort of the I-35 project in Austin, where, urban highway, help separate and segregate a community. There's a conversation about what to do about it now. And there's different visions. And the people that had worked on that project have allowed themselves to think big, which is great, because we need to envision a bigger future. And they have some great plans for how they can stitch the community back together. There's a couple different proposals that are out there, including capping in some cases, turning the highway into an urban boulevard. But there's also a realism that they are operating in a system, as it stands right now, where it's not just sort of the vision of what can be done in the local community. They're also dealing with funding constraints. They're dealing with different approaches to transportation infrastructure investment that may be present at the state level. So one of the pieces that really struck me when we were doing this research was that the Transportation Institute at Texas A&M that does a lot of the modeling, transportation modeling for these big infrastructure investments, was evaluating the I-35 scenarios, the different ways. Are they going to expand it, doubling down on the 20th century model? Are they going to cap it? Are we going to do some restorative development work? And one of the quotes in there said something to the effect of, and they were projecting that there would be longer commute times if you transformed it into an urban boulevard or made it a more sort of pedestrian-oriented, multimodal community investment. And they were projecting that there'd be longer commuting times. And they said, I am actually quoting, "It does not seem realistic that people will be willing to do this. A much more likely scenario is that jobs and population will grow differently across the region in response to long travel times between the Austin suburbs and downtown Austin. Some people will move closer to their existing job. Others will move their job closer to their home. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic experience, we also know that some workers with flexibility will choose to not commute every day." And that was put forward in the report as a flaw in the plans, whereas other people are looking at it as exactly, that's what we're trying to do. This is the future that we want to see. So, the folks that were working in Austin, and to circle back in a very, very roundabout way to your original question, the folks that were involved in the work in Austin knew how heavy of a lift that would be, because they do need to get the State Department of Transportation to sign off on this. So I would say that if we reconvened everyone today, the optimism might be a little bit more guarded just because the numbers are smaller than what people were envisioning could be possible. But I think the recognition of the challenges that were ahead would be the same.
Yeah, I mean, FTexDot, that's me saying that, not you, so it's okay. But I read that in the piece, the quote, and I've obviously, I'm an Austin person. I went to school there for 7 years. I, wrote my master's thesis on the politics of urban rail there. I'm very ensconced in the ideas, and I have my own theories about I-35 myself. But I did see that at the time when TTI, which is not my favorite organization either, who I've also quarreled with in the past, they make these statements that just basically are continuations of our auto-dominated future. And it's frustrating to have them, kind of have some sort of authority and then TxDOT be able to use that as a cudgel against new thinking, like the folks at Reconnect Austin and others who are trying to do something different, do something that's going to be better for the city, in my humble opinion. So it is frustrating to see that state DOT getting some help from a group that's supposed to be advocating for transportation and when they're just advocating for cars.
Right. And I would say that there's a lot of focus on the infrastructure bill and on federal policy, and rightfully so. I'm not saying that we should not pay attention to federal policy, or even that we should pay less attention to federal policy. But in reality, the locus of decision making that really matters is that on the ground level. The closer you get to where the actual infrastructure is being built, the more it matters that the people there are on board with maybe maybe the state departments, because of how states control so much of the transportation funding system, they might have a slightly disproportionate role there. But, there's a lot of work. If federal transportation policy and dollars did not change at all, not a word of legislative text other than just to extend the status quo was passed, if you had strong commitment from your local Department of Transportation in coordination with local stakeholders, your metropolitan planning organization had a strong board and was committed to the issues of multimodal mobility, committed to walkability, committed to sustainability and equity. And if your state Department of Transportation was supportive, or at least wasn't standing in the way, you could do a lot of what we need to do. It's been a little while since I've dove into the weeds of federal transportation law, but a lot of our highway programs, you can, if you took your highway funding and took the sort of the fix it first mantra and mostly focused on the potholes, and also used your flexible funding to expand other modes of transportation, that could do a lot of good. Land use, it's related to transportation funding, but if you're making the right land use decisions, then your transportation funding can be more equitable. You can build, I tend to think that people don't focus enough on just simple bus service, not just bus rapid transit, just getting the buses to run on time and run frequently. There's a big difference between a 7-minute wait between every bus arrival at your stop and a 25-minute wait or even a 15-minute wait. So there are things you can do with existing policy and resources that you can have a lot of impact. And likewise, if you have lots of more money coming in, including for multimodal transportation, it doesn't guarantee that if you don't have that consensus at the local level, that it's going to be spent wisely. I've seen enough complete streets project proposals, and don't get me wrong, I think complete streets are a good concept, but I've seen complete streets projects that are functionally just, we're going to make space for bikes as long as it doesn't inconvenience a single driver. It's not actually a neutral playing field. It still is auto-oriented development, but it has some window dressing on it, or it's its own version of greenwashing. So, I think that, again, to get to that issue of paralysis that I mentioned earlier, everyone's waiting for the federal government to do something and for some of this transformative federal legislation. And we should hope for that and we should work towards that, but it shouldn't stop us from doing the work on the ground.
Yeah. I've heard so many times there's a lot of flexibility in the federal funding for states, and then the states are the ones that obviously have a lot of power over where that money goes. And then if the state is a certain way, then it happens. I know in California here, we have a lot of money that just automatically passes through to MPOs, which is a big deal. There's a lot of forward thinking going on in San Diego, for example, right now. But if the state DOTs in a lot of other states, even in California for that matter, there's still folks that are road first. It's hard to be flexible when they're not flexible. Another question I have for you is thinking about what is and isn't infrastructure. I imagine that was a discussion as well. Housing comes to mind as an important infrastructure, but it gets me going back to that kind of that systems thinking. And I'm wondering if we should just reframe the discussion as something like life systems rather than quote unquote infrastructure. I think it was Linda Samuels, who was on the show a little while ago, was talking about, when we changed the name from public works to infrastructure and why we did it. And maybe it's due for another change because it can't just be about, wires, pipes, and roads.
Right. And that's a tricky concept because if infrastructure means everything, it means nothing. I think there's a political dynamic to this where, because there's general agreement that infrastructure is important, there's this push to make sure infrastructure means everything so we can fund everything that we need. So I kind of push back that a little bit. At the same time, as you said, it's more than roads and pipes and wires. It clearly is. And so I think if you asked the 20 or so people that were in the room for the Shaw Symposium, you would have a general consensus that infrastructure is more than just that narrow definition of how we've traditionally conceived it. I think there would be probably strong consensus that some modern connectivity technology like broadband should be included. Climate resilience should also be included in that sense. And housing. Those are sort of elements that are very tied to the built environment that should be included in that definition. If you ask 20 people, you might get 20 different answers about the balance of things that are under debate as whether it's infrastructure or not. And it would be helpful, I do think, to find a way to frame it that conveys the importance and the necessity for our communities to thrive and the built environment to thrive. Whether that word is infrastructure, whether it's public works, whether it's, life systems, like you said, that something that conveys the systemic nature and purposely broadens it out, I think that could be a good thing as well. Because you've been involved in this field for long enough. At first, sustainability was the catchword, and then it was livability. Once that became stigmatized, then it became resilience. And there's been, I'm sure I'm missing a couple different euphemisms that were thrown in there to make sure that we were not automatically triggering the people that yell Agenda 21 every time that you talk about mixed use development or density near transit. But I do think, just like I was talking about evolution of communities, the evolution of our language matters. And that has been a theme of your recent podcasts that I've been listening to. And that, I don't know if we've necessarily figured out the way that we're going to communicate this moving forward. But I do think something that's come out is that all these issues are important and that we need to be thinking of them in a systems way. So I like any phrasing that emphasizes that systems approach.
And that'll get co-opted at some point too in the future.
Right, exactly.
If that ever took off. Well, there's 10 key takeaways in here. There's 7 pieces to the framework for investing. How should agencies and government entities use this framework that you all put out?
So the framework is, again, every community is different. The challenges they're facing, the parameters they're facing, their constraints, their opportunities, they're all going to be different. So we called it a framework. We decided not to call it a roadmap or anything. I mean, also roadmap conveys the wrong message if we're talking about multimodal infrastructure anyway.
A subway map, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. The system map, the transit system map. But what we wanted to do was highlight sort of the key considerations, talk about the framework for the way practitioners should be thinking about this, planners should be thinking about this. And so we wanted to highlight sort of broad conceptual points that we wanted people to keep in mind. So they're high level things like first, do no harm. We're looking at, and that ties into the equity piece that we've kind of alluded to and said a couple of times explicitly, but hasn't been sort of the core focus of this conversation. But you look at sort of the tragic consequences of bulldozing, in some cases struggling, but in some cases thriving, in many cases a combination of both, predominantly African-American communities at the turn of the century. And then the fact that we went decades before, obviously researchers and advocates and people within the community knew about that theft of wealth and how that ties into current wealth gaps. It's just being mainstreamed now where people are talking about it. And often it's not being talked about in an intelligent way. So, one of the things that one of the key points of the framework that I like to emphasize is the first, do no harm. In order to create a better future, are you destroying wealth? Are you destroying assets in order to create it? And that doesn't always mean the answer is that you shouldn't proceed. Redevelopment needs to happen sometimes, but some of the other elements of the framework tie into that. So, there's a big difference between if you need to add growth of housing stock in the urban core, there's a difference in impacts if you're building on an empty parking lot or a vacant warehouse versus if you're redeveloping an existing apartment building that is currently serving lower income tenants. So that doesn't mean that we can never redevelop a property, but are you looking at the other elements of the framework? Are you avoiding burden shifting? Are you sort of creating wealth for others or passing the costs to people that don't get to benefit? Are you advancing equity goals? Do disadvantaged communities have a direct stake in the process, the redevelopment process, and the say about what happens in their communities? Are various community and institutional stakeholders involved? And is the financing aligned? So if you look at any one of these pieces like individually, you may not get the answer. But if you look at them as a collective, we're hoping that we're raising a number of issues for consideration that when you have a proposal, for a transit line or for an urban park or for a housing redevelopment that involves some degree of displacement or, eminent domain or the use of some other tool, have you thought about it from the other perspectives? And have you answered some of these other questions to do so in a way that you are maximizing sort of our future potential without putting it on the backs of disadvantaged populations? So that's kind of what we're trying to achieve with this framework. And it's, again, to emphasize the systems thinking that everything is interconnected and we can't look at things in silos anymore.
So I'm going to go through the 7 pieces. First, do no harm, avoid burden shifting, advance equity goals, involve community and institutional stakeholders, align finance mechanisms, invest in resilience, and then measure and evaluate. The measure and evaluate one was interesting to me because, in transportation, and I've talked about this a number of times on the show, I always feel like there's not really a central set of goals that we have that we can measure against. I mean, we can measure all the things we want, but if it's not against, an overall top line goal, is it actually worthwhile? And I'm wondering if there's the same kind of thing for housing as well. Is there a national top line goal at the federal level, HUD, et cetera, for housing in the United States? And so if there isn't, maybe there is, but I'm not as ensconced in that world. If there isn't, though, what are we measuring? Are we measuring just the amount of money we're spending? Are we measuring the amount of housing units that we're building? It's lost on me sometimes, and I want to measure everything too. GIS is my jam, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm always curious, do we have the goals in place that we can measure against?
So we have lots of metrics, we have lots of goals, and we have lots of targets. But there isn't, I would say that in the housing field, there is not an equivalent of Vision Zero in the transportation one. Vision Zero, even though it's often thrown out there by people that are not actually doing the work to try and get us to Vision Zero, hence my complete streets comments earlier in this conversation, the closest thing we have to that is ending homelessness, functionally ending homelessness. And there is sort of a metric, there's a recognition that we'll never get to a point in society, or it's unlikely we'll get to a point in society that you will never have a single person that is without a home, especially if we look at the holistic view of what defines homelessness, which includes people that are, couch surfing or not necessarily unsheltered. The definition of functionally ending homelessness means that you have the system and resources in place that you can, within a given period of time, rehouse everyone that becomes homeless. So you can intake and assist more people that are becoming homeless. So that's sort of the closest thing we have to a vision zero. But this is, again, an example of silos. You could talk to housing practitioners that never think about homelessness, and homelessness practitioners that are generally not as focused on the broader housing market and looking at it as a whole and how they interrelate. And that's not because people don't recognize the connection between the two, but there are silos in our funding programs. There's silos in the housing unit. There are housing that is specifically targeted for certain populations. So even within the housing space, there's these silos. One of the reports that recently came out that illustrates this, it's it's called the Inflection Points paper. I'm using that as a shorthand, but it was analysis that showed that when median housing costs reach a given threshold of median income, which is around the 32% range, that it's an inflection point. You see a steep increase in homelessness. So it really illustrates how the broader market, the broader cost of housing that's being faced by someone with median household income or 80% of area median income, how that actually has spillover effects down the spectrum into the realm of homelessness. I would say cost burden is our other metric. If you're defined as being cost burdened, if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing. So aside from ending homelessness, there's no sort of agreed upon metric that we're all striving towards. So you have to look at sort of the whole picture, and you have to look at the range of geography. So that's something that we've worked on with the Terwiliger Center for the past couple of years. We published our Home Attainability Index, which is a collection of metrics at the regional level that look at both just general cost burdens. It looks at disparities by race and ethnicity. It looks at segregation. It looks at affordability by tenure or by rental versus ownership. And we look at some of the broader systems of how good is the transit system, how long are commutes, and trying to create a whole. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we don't have a single vision that we can point to, but we're trying to do work to make it easier for people to look at the range of interrelated metrics that can help us define what success looks like at the local and regional level.
Awesome. Where can folks find the report and more about your work if they want to check it out?
Sure. So all of ULI reports are available for download at the Knowledge Finder website at uli.org. You'll be able to download those resources. You can also get more resources on my website. So I, in addition to being the visiting research fellow at the Terwiliger Center, I am the president of a small applied housing policy research consulting firm called Neighborhood Fundamentals. All of those same reports are available at neighborhoodfundamentals.com. So those are the two sites, and that you'll be able to get all of the research and analysis that's being done.
Can folks follow you on Twitter too?
Oh, yes. Forgot about that. Twitter at Michael A. Spots, SPOTTS. My tweeting tends to be episodic. I'm very active and then I go dormant for a little while. But generally speaking, I try and comment on a range of housing, community development, and equity issues. And if you catch me on a Saturday, there's also going to be some college football.
I appreciate that. Mine's Star Wars, soccer, and transportation, urban planning. So yeah, it runs the gamut. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.